Story 1 credited to Charlie Becker. You ever been out on a stretch of highway so long you forget where you are? That's what it's like for a trucker sometimes. Hours on the road, just you and the hum of the engine and whatever radio station you can pull in through the static. I've been driving for 15 years and nothing much rattles me. I've seen all kinds of things, drunk drivers, accidents, you name it. But this one night last winter, I can't shake it. I was heading up through Wyoming on a long haul to Montana, carrying a load of farming equipment. It was about 2 a.m., cold as hell. No snow, but that sharp kind of wind that cuts through your jacket. The road I was on was lonely. Just 2 lanes, no lights, and not another vehicle in sight for miles. You get used to that in this job, but there was something about the night that felt off. It was quiet, but too quiet, if that makes sense. The kind of silence where you feel like you should be hearing something, but you're not. I shook it off and kept driving, watching the road stretch out in front of me. After a while, I saw something up ahead, just a faint glow at first. It was a car pulled over on the side of the road, hazards flashing. I couldn't tell if it had broken down or gotten into an accident, but the way it was sitting, angled down into the ditch, didn't look good. Now, as a trucker, you see people in trouble on the road all the time. 9 times out of 10, it's a simple breakdown, and they're just waiting for a tow. But this one felt different. It was that gut feeling, the one that tells you something's not right, even when you can't see it. I slowed down, pulling off to the shoulder a few yards ahead. The car was an old beat-up sedan, dark color, couldn't tell what make. The driver's side door was wide open. No one was inside. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out of the cab, and started walking toward the car. The air was freezing, and every step I took, the gravel under my boots sounded too loud, like it was echoing off the empty road. When I got to the car, I leaned in and looked around. No keys in the ignition, airbag hadn't deployed. But there was this weird smell, like burnt rubber, maybe mixed with something else. Oil, maybe. It wasn't strong, but it was there. I backed up and looked around. "Hello!" I called out, shining my flashlight toward the ditch. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the empty fields on either side of the road. I wasn't about to go wandering too far from the truck, but something in my gut told me to check the area a bit more thoroughly. I walked a little ways down the road, shining the light into the darkness, looking for any sign of movement, any sign of anyone. But there was nothing, not a sound. That's when I heard it. A soft, steady crunching noise coming from behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding, and pointed the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just my truck, sitting there in the dark. I scanned the area again, starting to feel uneasy. Maybe it was just the cold, or maybe I was spooking myself, but something about this whole situation didn't feel right. I walked back toward the car, planning to get a better look inside. Maybe check the glove compartment for some kind of clue, but as I reached for the door, I noticed something strange on the ground. Footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the car and into the field. The tracks were shallow, but definitely human. They disappeared about 10 feet into the dirt, swallowed up by the grass. My flashlight flickered for a second, the light dimming. My mind started racing. Where would someone be walking out here? There was nothing around. No houses, no gas stations, nothing for miles. I glanced back toward the truck, thinking maybe I should just drive off, call it in later, but something made me pause. I stood there for what felt like a long time, just listening to the wind and the sound of my own breathing. And then I realized what was bothering me the most. There was no sign of the driver, no blood, no obvious sign of injury, just those footsteps and the open door. I walked back to my truck, locked the doors behind me, and picked up my phone to call the local sheriff's office. They were polite enough, told me they'd send someone out to take a look. Probably just someone who got spooked, they said. Maybe walk to the nearest town, but here's the thing. The nearest town was 30 miles away. I sat in my truck for a few minutes after the call, engine idling, waiting to see if maybe, just maybe, someone would come out of the darkness. But no one did, and that unsettling feeling never left me. I pulled back onto the road and drove off, leaving that broken-down car behind. but the whole drive I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important. That whoever had been in that car was out there somewhere, walking through the freezing night, alone. I kept thinking about those footsteps and how they just stopped. I don't know what happened that night, and I'll probably never know. But sometimes when I'm out on the road late at night and the radio cuts out for a moment, I remember the sound of that wind and the stillness of that car. And I wonder, did I make the right choice leaving? Maybe. Maybe not. But one thing's for sure, I don't stop for stranded cars anymore. Story 2 credited to Jake Miller. I've been trucking for 20 years, so I know how the road works. It's got a rhythm. Days and nights blur together, and every trip, no matter how familiar, has a way of throwing something unexpected at you. I've had my share of close calls, but nothing that messed with my head quite like this. It was mid-January a few years back. I was on a late run through Montana, hauling from Billings to Missoula. Middle of the night, snow starting to pick up. Not a blizzard, but enough to make the roads slick and visibility poor. Dispatch was pushing this load hard, so I didn't have much choice but to keep moving. The money was good, and I thought, hell, it's only a few more hours. The highway out there is one of those long, straight stretches where you can go for miles without seeing another car, especially at that hour. The snow makes everything feel slower, quieter, eerie even. Just me and the hum of the engine, my eyes flicking between the road and the side mirrors out of habit. Everything was normal until I noticed something odd. My GPS kept losing signal, recalculating every few minutes. Now out here, that's not too strange. But what got me was how it would tell me to turn off the road when there was nothing but flat fields and snow on either side. No intersecting highways or exits, just nothing. I figured it was the weather messing with the satellite, but something about it felt off. That's when I saw the headlights in my mirror, faint at first, far behind me. I didn't think much of it. Someone else braving the late-night drive, probably. But they were gaining fast. Way faster than anyone should have been driving in those conditions. I watched them get closer and closer until they were right on my tail. A beat-up sedan, couldn't make out the make or model, but it looked like it had seen better days. I figured they'd pass me. People get impatient behind trucks all the time, but this car just stayed there, hugging my bumper. No headlights flashing, no horn, just following. Now I don't scare easy, but something about this didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way the snow was coming down, how isolated it felt out there, but I was on edge. I tapped my brakes, trying to give them a hint to back off, but instead they got even closer. My trailer's lights lit up their windshield, but I still couldn't make out the driver, just a shadow behind the wheel. I radioed dispatch, asking if there were any roadblocks or accidents ahead, hoping for an excuse to stop, but the line was dead. No cell signal either, so I had no way of knowing if anything was wrong up the road. After a few more minutes, the car finally pulled up alongside me. I glanced over, trying to get a look at who was behind the wheel, but all I saw was a man's face staring straight ahead. He wasn't looking at me, just forward like I wasn't even there. And next to him in the passenger seat, a woman. Her eyes were locked on mine. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her expression that chilled me, a kind of vacant look like she was waiting. I slowed down, hoping they'd just move on, but they didn't. Instead, they matched my speed. For miles, they drove right next to me in the other lane, not passing, not falling back, just keeping pace. My heart was pounding, and I felt this weight in my chest. I've had plenty of weird encounters on the road, but nothing like this. Finally, I saw a sign for a rest stop up ahead, a small one, probably a gas station or diner. I figured I could pull in, maybe grab a coffee, get my head straight. But when I turned on my blinker and shifted lanes to exit, the sedan did the same, following me into the lot. I parked near the lights, figuring I'd feel safer where it was well lit. But as soon as I cut the engine, the sedan rolled to a stop a few spaces over. The man and woman sat there, engine still running. They didn't get out, didn't turn off the car, just sat there watching. I'll admit I didn't want to get out. But sitting in the cab wasn't doing me any good either, so I grabbed my thermos and headed toward the gas station. The cold bit into me as soon as I opened the door, but it wasn't the temperature that made me shiver. It was the way they kept staring at me, like they knew something I didn't. Inside, the gas station was empty, just a cashier, a kid really, scrolling through her phone behind the counter. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hands shaking just enough to spill a bit, and went up to pay. The whole time I couldn't stop thinking about those two in the car. Why were they following me? What did they want? I asked the cashier if she'd seen them pull in. She shrugged, barely looking up. "Lots of people stop here," she said, clearly not interested. I felt stupid even asking, but something in me just wouldn't settle. I stayed in the station for a while, hoping they'd leave, but when I peeked through the window, their car was still there. Same position, same people, and the woman, her eyes. I could see them through the glass, still locked on me, unblinking. I took a deep breath, told myself I was overreacting, and went back to my truck. As soon as I got in, they pulled out of the lot, heading back onto the highway. Relief washed over me for a second, but then something hit me. They weren't gone. They were waiting. I didn't want to drive. I didn't want to get back on that road, but I had a job to do, and sitting there wasn't an option. I started the engine, pulled out of the lot, and sure enough, after a few miles, there they were. Their taillights ahead, waiting on the shoulder. As soon as I passed, they pulled out again, sliding right behind me, headlights glaring in my mirrors. That's when it hit me. I was their target. This wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. They were toying with me, seeing how long I'd last before I broke. But I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I sped up, as fast as I could in those conditions, pushing the truck harder than I should have. My hands were gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. And for the next 50 miles, that sedan followed me. Never getting too close, but never far enough away to forget they were there. Finally, the lights of Missoula appeared in the distance, and just like that, the sedan vanished. No turnoff, no exit, just gone. I pulled into the drop-off, shaking, exhausted, my mind racing. I've done hundreds of hauls since then, but I've never forgotten that night. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but every time I see headlights in my rear view, I can't help but wonder, are they still out there? Story 3, credited to Jason Hargrove. You ever been on the road so long that the lines on the highway blur into one endless stretch? It happens more often than you think when you're driving trucks for a living. You spend hours alone with nothing but your thoughts, and sometimes those thoughts can turn into something else, something darker. It was the middle of October last year. I was hauling a load of heavy machinery up to Spokane, Washington from Dallas. Long route, but I had a good rig, and the pay was worth it. I'd been driving for about 12 hours straight, with just a couple of quick pit stops to stretch my legs. By the time it hit midnight, I was well into northern Utah, surrounded by nothing but miles of open road and desert. Now, any trucker will tell you, when you're driving through these parts at night, you can go hours without seeing another soul. Sometimes it's peaceful, but that night, something felt off. I don't know if it was the isolation or just the way the wind was blowing, but I had that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, the one that tells you something's not quite right. I was pushing through, figuring I'd stop in another hour or so at a rest area, grab some coffee, maybe take a quick nap. Then I saw something ahead on the side of the road, just barely in my headlights. A figure walking, thumb out, looking for a ride. At first, I didn't think much of it. Hitchhikers are rare these days, especially in the middle of nowhere, but it happens. Maybe their car broke down or they ran out of gas. I slowed down as I got closer, not really planning to stop, just curious. And that's when I saw him. He was a tall guy, mid-30s, maybe early 40s, wearing an old army jacket. His face was mostly hidden under the shadow of a baseball cap, but I could see enough to know something was off. The way he stood there, completely still, just staring at my truck as I approached, gave me this strange, unsettled feeling. I've picked up hitchhikers before, no problem. But this guy? Something wasn't sitting right with me. I rolled down my window just enough to talk without getting out of the cab. "You need help?" I asked, keeping my hand on the door handle, ready to roll the window back up if I had to. He didn't answer right away, just stared. Then, after what felt like too long, he nodded, still not saying a word. I glanced down the road expecting to see a car broken down somewhere nearby, but there was nothing. Just empty highway stretching out in both directions. "Where's your car?" I asked. He pointed vaguely toward the desert. "Back there," he muttered. His voice was low, gravelly, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in a while. That didn't make sense. There weren't any roads leading off the highway, at least not for another couple of miles. And why would someone be walking out in the desert in the middle of the night? "I can call a tow truck for you," I offered, figuring that was the safest way to get out of this situation. But he shook his head. "Just need a ride," he said, stepping a little closer to the truck, a few miles down the road. Now, here's where the alarm bells really started going off in my head. This guy was acting way too calm for someone supposedly stranded in the middle of nowhere. I'd been driving long enough to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming at me not to let him in. "I'm not heading that way," I lied, "but I can get someone to help you." That's when he got agitated. His hand clenched into a fist, and he took another step toward the cab, his face still mostly hidden under the cap. "Come on, man, just a couple miles, don't be like that." I didn't like his tone, the way he said it, like he was entitled to the ride. My hand hovered over the gear shift, ready to pull off if things went south. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice firmer this time. "I can't help you." He didn't say anything after that. Just stared at me for another long second, his face barely visible in the dim light of the truck's cabin. Then he stepped back and turned, walking off into the dark. I watched him in the rearview mirror as I pulled away, his figure getting smaller and smaller until he was just a dot on the horizon. For a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, even as I sped down the highway, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. A couple of miles down the road, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another car, parked on the side of the highway. Its hazards were flashing, and the hood was popped open like someone had been trying to fix it. But here's the thing, there was nobody in or around the car, and it wasn't just broken down, it looked like it had been abandoned for a while. Dust had settled on the windshield and one of the tires was flat. I slowed down, my headlights sweeping over the empty vehicle. That weird feeling was back, stronger this time. I kept thinking about the hitchhiker, the way he pointed vaguely into the desert. And now here was this car, just sitting there, like it had been left in a hurry. I didn't stop. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe the guy was lying. Maybe that wasn't his car at all. Maybe he wasn't just some stranded traveler. I kept driving, faster now, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. The road stretched on, empty and silent, but I kept glancing in the rear view, half expecting to see that guy's face again staring back at me from the dark. I made it to the rest stop about 40 minutes later. I parked the rig, got out, and made my way inside, feeling like I'd just escaped something I couldn't quite explain. The rest area was quiet, just a couple of other truckers getting coffee or taking a break, but I couldn't shake the unease from earlier. I sat down at one of the tables, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I overheard two drivers talking a few tables away. One of them mentioned a guy they'd seen walking along the highway a few miles back. Tall, wearing an army jacket. Hitchhiking. My stomach turned. I didn't say anything. Just grabbed my coffee, went back to the truck, and drove off. Whatever was going on out there, I didn't want to be a part of it. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing like that night. I still don't know what that guy's deal was or if he was even telling the truth. But I do know one thing. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore.